why are empires enduring, or are empires enduring? What are empires? What's the difference between empires and other forms of power politics, maybe? Is it the vocabulary of empires that endures, as we talked about just a moment ago, or are there political structures that have some kind of continuity? Or is this a story of discontinuity from an imperial age to something else that we have now? All of that's on the table. I've asked the speakers to be poignant and brief to get to the key issues, so we'll have plenty of time to discuss and debate. Almost everybody's come from a long way, and I know that people have things to say, so we want to make sure that that's the case. So, who starts? Wayne, I guess you're first.
Okay. My name is Wayne Hudson. I'm from Australia. I'm one of the Southern Hemisphere people here. I'm one of the Asian people here. So I have very different biases from most of the speakers, as you will pick up. I'm in favor. Yeah, okay, you can hear now? Is that okay?
Hello now? Yeah, okay. Will I start again? No? Yes.
That was important.
Okay. My name's Wayne Hudson. I'm from Australia. I have a different background to almost everyone here because I'm involved heavily in Asia. I've been to almost every Asian country. I've been to every town in some Asian countries. I studied in Europe. I lived in Europe for years. My biases are different, and that will explain why I say different things. The first thing I want to say is that when we try to think about empire, we have to be careful to distinguish philosophy, history, and politics, and in each case to have a rigorous method. If we blur all of them, as I think we're tempted to do, we talk nonsense. If we want to talk philosophy, we have to talk analytic philosophy, and we have to talk it now, and we have to talk about Oxford because Harvard is now collapsed. So we have to talk about modal metaphysics. Now, I'm not going to do that now, but I want you to see the point. If you want to talk about universals, as Russell did, you must know what it means in contemporary philosophy now, and why Harvard has failed. Why we no longer read Quine or Davidson, let alone Putnam. So on the philosophy, we need rigor. On the history, we need even more rigor than the philosophy because people who talk about history talk complete nonsense. I'm a global historian of ideas, intellectual history. I don't do political history, but I have done, for years and years and years, I've run global education courses that have been taken up all over the world. And what they do is that they teach you the whole history of the world in 6 hours. Now, how can you do that? Well, you have to abandon the kind of delusions that I think people in our conference have. If you want to do the history, you really have to go for two kinds of precision. The first is historical precision. So if you want to talk about an empire anywhere, you better know where it is. You better know why the map you've just used is not correct, because the sea has moved and the rivers have moved. You need to know what they meant by the language they use, not what you mean. And you need to know how the actual historiography is false, because no major state writes a true history of itself. And we can prove that in great detail now using archaeology and genetics. History of Japan and China is largely false. We can prove it using the sciences. Now, moving to politics, the same sort of thing applies, and I don't want to get into political arguments, but if we want to talk about Russia now, we talk to Paul, and we really do have to know what governmental regimes are working in Russian villages. We can't talk in the megabunk that, frankly, Americans largely do talk. And we must have Russian language. If you don't have Russian language, shut up. You want to talk about China, you need Chinese. If you don't have Chinese, go home. And if you think there's a Chinese empire or ever was, you're a fool. So a hard line on a rigorous method in each of the three. But of course we want to talk about all of them. How do we do that? Well, we go to the natural sciences and to mathematics. Now I won't talk maths today, but my global history course is math. It has no numbers, but it's entirely mathematical. And that's why I can teach all of it to you in 6 hours. If you want to do something that covers those three bases, we have to go to the sciences. Why? Because, and now I'll cheer up at least David Pan, because Peirce is a great American philosopher, and we all need to read him again now. And Peirce had some of the best things to say about history that have ever been said by anybody. And condensing it into simple language, Peirce said that the universe organizes itself in the same way everywhere, and if you work out the organization the universe uses, you've got it. And that's absolutely correct. And once you've got that idea, you can do the empire thing without mistake. If you don't have that idea, you do what people who write global history of the wrong side do. You read paperbacks and put them together in a kind of walk. I've now read for this conference all the books on empire in English in the last 20 years. They're all rubbish. What are the sources? There are no sources. The sources are other paperbacks, mainly written in English. True, French cite French books, not English books. Russian cite Russian books. German cite German books. Nobody reads all of it, except Smith, who's dead. And so what we're dealing with when we talk global history of the wrong sort is paperbacks and the mythologies of states. We can't do any of that. We have to go to natural science, we have to go to mathematics, and we have to have a sense of how the universe organizes. Now, of course, we have to historicize all that. We understand that. Time, not only space. So we don't go to Kant with respect to Lars, because no one with any sense thinks that time and space are forms of intuition. You could have thought that when Kant writes, but no one thinks that now, except one of the 9 main physicists who write about time in the last book on time, which I'm sure you read. Now, I've nearly finished. Let me try and bring this down to our conference rather precisely. Applying what I've said, the first point is you have to know what you mean by empire, or you better drop it. If it's an analogy term, drop it. If you think there's a Persian Empire, and a Mongolian Empire, and a Tongan Empire, and a British Empire, go home. This is fraud. Total fraud. Words don't give you empire. If you think an empire is somewhere with an emperor, you know no history. Because lots of places with emperors didn't have an empire. That's basic history. If you think there was a Spanish Empire, you might notice it was the Spanish monarchy. If you think the Kaiserreich was an empire, you might have a good look at the 3 kings. And so on and so on and so on. So let's get rid of the junk about empires. There are about 90 so-called empires. The actual systems are different. The meaning of empire is different in 14 different languages. And of course, time modifies the reality. We can't just talk spatially. We have to look to time distinctions. The worst book on empire is a British book by an Indian scholar, Kumar. It's been given rave reviews. I read it for you. It's complete rubbish. He's written a recent essay this year revising his views, and the revisionist piece is good. So if you want something good, look at the revisionist piece. In the revisionist piece, he points out that he forgot about time. That's right. But he didn't just forget about time. He left out Islam, China, and the whole of the Asian world. Well, I have trouble. He talked about Rome, Britain, and France. Well, it won't do. And he knew nothing about Rome because he had high school Latin. High school Latin doesn't help. The word imperial won't help unless you know what the imperium was. It's nothing to do with imperial. And if you talk about sovereignty, that's great, but you better know what that meant originally too. And if you think there were ever states in the ancient world, you need a test other than words. If you think there was a polis in Greece, you better have evidence other than a word. Particularly if your word is an English translation of a Greek translation. But the word wasn't Greek. All right, the word democracy, as you probably will know, means the violence of the people. If you don't know that, then it illustrates my point. Words won't do the work. So my first point is that we have to be rigorous in philosophy, politics, and history, and they're all different, and we don't want to do that because we want to cross the stuff. You have to go to natural science and mathematics. Not numbers, but mathematics. What does that mean? It means base structure that you arrive at through construction. Lars brought in Kant with the wrong bit, because of course Kant didn't recognize intellectual intuition. He was wrong. Victor and Schelling were right because they said mathematics is central to philosophy. Kant banned it from philosophy. Therefore, we shouldn't go to Kant, because in mathematics, using construction, we can do intellectual intuition. And therefore, we can do the project I'm describing. Now, I've only got about 3 more things to say. The first one is that modern historical consciousness is now finished, and modern historiography can't be defended. So if your history is from modern history, you're in trouble. Because modern history thinks you can do the history of things by studying texts and translating them. But we know from the history of Indonesia and Asia, that's not right. Because we do have the texts, and we have translated them, and we find out the history of Japan is only one island. All the rest of the islands aren't in history. We do China, we find it's essentially fictional. They're not where they say they were. We can apply this argument to Indonesia and Japan, who have no literary connections, but are genetically so close they must be similar. All right. So modern historical consciousness is now essentially in trouble. I can't prove that, but I can give examples if you want them. The second point is that if we get rid of analogical talk about empire, then the point Russell makes is right. We have to ask what kinds of political structure and arrangement were there in various places and times, and if some are recurrent, why? And they are recurrent, Russell's right about that, but they're recurrent because Peirce is right. Universe solves same problem using same organizational forms, preferably. Sometimes you don't use the right form, but then you go out of existence, and I worry for the United States. Third point, if we want to discuss contemporary situations now, then I think we need again to go to the organizational form of the universe, and then historicize it by bringing in the time factor, and then we arrive, I think, at what we should be talking about, which is how the historical record, the global historical record, can help us form a new form of human community. Because we can't stay where we are. We can't have the kind of capitalism we've had. We can't have the Washington Consensus. The Chinese are right about that. They see we can't have that. And we can't have democracy, because once again, democracy has elected immoral force. Well, if the people vote for a moral force, we have to have a better political system. for that. How do you do it? Well, the thing you have to do is you have to study the historical record using organizational principles, and you have to pay as much attention to pre-modern societies as modern societies. Marx is right about that. If you're not on top of this, have a look at the new edition of Marx. It's now been released in 110 volumes. Have a look at the 32 volumes of the notebooks and his work on cultural anthropology. Because Marx saw that if you don't want production of value, which is what capitalism is about, you have to look at all the societies, the majority in the history of the world, that didn't do that. If you think capitalism is natural and inevitable, elementary anthropology will knock you over in 10 minutes. Concluding, we do need a new form of human community. It will be about exact political and economic structures. It won't come from the left or the right. It has to come from people who have the engineering and who make claims that have empirical content. I agree with Russell about that. It won't be sentimental moralism. It won't be Kant. It certainly won't be American political philosophy, which I hope we'll throw in the bin very soon. I don't think it'll be Carl Schmitt. I offend many in saying that, but I don't think Carl will do it. I do think Russian orthodoxy has an enormous contribution to the new form of human community. So I play the Russian card there. I think China has an enormous contribution because it's better organized than the United States. I've recently been all over China, and you come back to America and you can't get to the town only 50 miles away because the train's broken and there isn't a bus. So I've now finished. This is the right conference about the right topic, but we need to ask why political structures occur and how to historicize them if you're not going to do it in the Renaissance way. Renaissance way, and this is Russell's universal particular point, thinks that things are local to their time. They're defined by the time in which they fall, but nothing's defined by the time in which it falls. That's just a fantasy. You must have time, but you must have universals and particulars, as Russell said. But then you have to remember what non-philosophers never remember, that universals are higher logical order. A universal is not something that's everywhere. That's what it means in common sense. It's not what it means in logic. At that point I give up and I hand it over to someone more capable.
Well, it's always an enormous pleasure to hear Wayne. And in fact, I first met Wayne when I went to my very first academic conference in the year 2002. And I don't think I've ever had the same fireworks at a conference without Wayne. So it is really wonderful. At the same time, it's quite a hard act to follow. And so everything that I'm now going to say will, I think, pale in comparison. But since I wanted to leave some time for discussion, I'll try and be very brief. And really just to make one point, which I think often comes up, and that is that, especially in the West, by which I mean the political West rather than the West as a civilization, we still harbour all sorts of illusions to do with the modern era and more specifically this so-called Westphalian settlement, where somehow there was such a big break in history and we've ended up with a system of national sovereign states and sort of transnational markets, and that now defines our perspective. It's a sort of main conceptual lens through which we view everything. We view the rest of history as somehow leading up to this point, and we now think that this is a universal model that will just continue for time immemorial. And I think that is a very precise illustration of some of what Wayne was saying, which is you completely abstract from history, you completely abstract from time and indeed from space, because you're using something which is not a universal, using a general form which you then impose on all locality and you try also to extend to the rest of the globe. And so it's, if you like to use a slightly simplistic formulation, it's a kind of bad general. It's a bad general category applied to both the particular and the universal. And the reason why it's bad is because it doesn't capture, it neither captures the diversity of local reality. So even Europe has never really conformed to this model of sovereign states and transnational markets, but it's been in some sense, squeezed into this. And it certainly doesn't capture other civilizations, again, for some of the reasons Wayne has already mentioned. And I think part of why this matters is because we somehow think that these 500 years of some sort of Westphalian order, which is mostly in fact a disorder and anarchic more than structured, actually somehow is more important than the 5,000 years preceding it. And that again is, I think, totally counterintuitive. Now, it's not to say that this Westphalian settlement hasn't brought us any progress or that it's all wrong, but it's just to say that you cannot somehow make this a necessary or normative settlement. It is highly contingent in historical terms, it's highly localized, and in fact it goes against at least three, I think, more permanent continuities in human history, which I think do transcend different civilizations. And I'll finish on those three. The first is that power is imperial in the sense of going beyond territorial borders, so going beyond the Westphalian sense of state sovereignty, because first of all, very often, de facto, powers want to stabilize their neighborhoods. Right? It's, if you like, the backyard when it comes to Central and Latin America, in the American case, all based around the Monroe Doctrine, but it's also what countries just do. They don't want hostile political regimes on their borders. Rightly or wrongly, but that's how a lot of political forms of organization work. You know, it's the old thing about, building up borders to protect yourself from the so-called barbarians. Whether they are or not is a different debate, but that's what we see with the Roman borders, or in a different context, the Chinese, Great War. So it's about stabilizing volatile backyards, to use a horrible term. Secondly, it's about creating some form of outlet for your trade and to have access to other markets. And again, we see that in human history in terms of commerce. And then thirdly, and that's perhaps the most important dimension, power is imperial because power tends to be connected to some sense of civilizing mission. Now, of course, there's going to be an enormous variety of that. And I don't want to suggest that all civilizing missions are of equal nature or meaning or value. But I think that is also part of political power. That it's connected with a sense of civilized life, rightly or wrongly. And therefore, I think power can never be conceptualized in a sort of Westphalian meaning. And that's why I think empires of very different kinds will endure. Not that they will ever be exactly the same. I mean, Wayne is absolutely right about the sheer difference in diversity. But think of capitalism as transcending territorial borders. Think of certain forms of political organization or religious communities transcending these borders. They will never be contained by this very artificial model. And really, the final point is, what's so fundamentally flawed about the Westphalian settlement is that it is an artifice imposed on a natural universe. And that's never going to end well. And therefore, I think Westphalia is not necessarily normative, it's certainly not the future, and it also doesn't really explain the last 500 years.
Thanks. The key observation that I want to make really hinges on a distinction between what we might call hard empires, in other words, unified states with political institutions and a center of power on the one hand, and the so-called soft legacies of empire on the other. And I think that this idea of the soft legacies of empire, I think is most apparent in world history, where we look at cases where a loose sort of civilizational zone has endured after the collapse of a unifying empire, or where you have multiple large states rising and falling in the same region. That kind of civilizational zone, that kind of soft legacy of empire tends to hold together because of a cultural gradient. And the term cultural gradient, I think, originally was used by Marshall Hodgson in his History of the Islamic World, where he pointed out that after the collapse of the early caliphates, after the loss of political unity, you had this enduring Islamicate civilization based on law and religion and social norms. And this maintained its coherence and its appeal because it had an air of universalism about it. In other words, it was able to attract barbarians, non-believers, etc., to assimilate to it. And we see the same kind of cultural gradient, the same kind of soft legacy of empire in other cases. For example, after Alexander the Great's conquest, we see it in the Hellenistic zone in the Middle East. We see it in East Asia, the influence of Sinic civilization. We see it with the Anglosphere after the breakup of the British Empire and other such cases. So there are many examples of the soft legacies of empire maintaining that kind of long-term cultural gradient. Now, I think this idea, this soft legacy of empire, has a couple of important implications. One is in daily life, in the institutions of daily life, those soft legacies often have much more substantial long-term impact than hard power, right? They penetrate society in a deeper and more sustainable way. They provide a kind of toolkit that can become embedded in how things get done, right? Whether it's law, religion, cultural practices, etc. Indeed, the fact that it's detached from a power, a center of hard power, actually can give it more credibility, right? More ability to adapt in different contexts, and therefore ease its acceptance long-term by outsiders, so to speak. So that's one implication of it. The second is that it provides a kind of cultural space or a common language or even implicit aspirations that can then become the building blocks for new centers of power to emerge. Perhaps new empires, new states emerge within the same zone and make use of some of that earlier toolkit and legacy. It can also create institutional frameworks that can reclaim some or most of the same space and operate within it. I think one of the most obvious examples today is much of the architecture of global governance, global trade, and so on really comes out of the legacy of the British Empire and its American successor. Indeed, I can think of hardly any instances of major transnational projects of integration that have not built in some way on cultural gradients and toolkits that draw from earlier imperial moments. Now, as far as present and future world order, I think there are a couple of sort of conclusions or questions which arise from that. One is if you're looking at great powers competing or would-be future global hegemons, one of their key characteristics that they need to have is the ability to create that kind of cultural gradient which can also outlast their own hard power. And if you take the case of rising Asian powers, China in particular, I think a fact that many people don't really give much weight to is that a so-called Chinese century cannot rely only on GDP and trade and aircraft carriers. I think there was a Chinese journalist who said that China should have 30 aircraft carriers. The US, I think, has 11 at the moment. But that kind of hard power is not going to be sufficient to create a Chinese century. It also requires a kind of openness amid the flows of a global cultural space and the spread of certain techniques or motifs from China to elsewhere that could catch on and survive without that kind of GDP and hard power to back it. Now, can China, or indeed any other rising Asian power, generate that kind of cultural gradient? I have great misgivings and great doubts about that. I think that there is a discourse of Chinese exceptionalism and insularity which would be a major obstacle to doing what previous world empires did, I think, more successfully. The only couple of things that I could imagine China offering which could spread and have some attraction to some around the world would be a certain kind of new class technocracy or a kind of high-tech monitoring or repression of subject populations. I can see that appealing to certain kinds of technocratic counterparts around the world, but I think that appeal would be fairly limited in any broader sense. I think it would be quite limited in its attractiveness or ability to spread elsewhere. Second implication is not really about great powers or about national units or would-be imperial centers. It's more about the higher scale of global governance in decades or even centuries to come. Right? If you are trying to legitimate empire-like and supranational, transnational institutions on a global scale, what kinds of toolkits or templates or cultural gradients left over from the past might one draw on in doing that? Right? I think any kind of supranational governance vision would be doing what a lot of earlier state founding projects did, namely trying to draw on those existing toolkits and use them to lend legitimacy to a vast new machinery of governance. And if we look at transnational integration or supranational governance projects now, they rely very, very heavily on sort of Anglosphere legacies, to a certain extent on continental European legacies, as well as a kind of bland modern technocracy. This, I think, obviously has a fairly limited potential orbit and appeal. It probably alienates as many segments of global public opinion as it attracts. So I think one possibility is that if you're looking for toolkits to sustain a kind of vision of global governance in the future, you would actually need to draw in a much more syncretic way from the legacy of multiple empires and multiple civilizational zones. So when you're talking about that kind of genuinely supranational, genuinely global scale, you need to do this in a different way than what we've seen playing out within regions historically, right? If you look at the rise and fall of empires, the rise and fall of regional power centers, they've often had very specific toolkits from things that have happened in their own neighborhood before, right? If you're really trying to appeal to the global public generally, you need to mix and match with a much broader toolkit. But I think that kind of soft legacy of empire does provide some lessons for what legitimacy looks like and for what a universalism that goes beyond the nation state might use to make sense of itself.
Good points. Let me just pick out a few that are salient to me, but that shouldn't impinge on your efforts to engage. First, I think the reference to the repeated reference to Westphalia. That's in Western political theory. That sets up the primacy of the nation, and in the discourse around empire, nation is the alternative. Anti-imperialists argue in terms of national sovereignty that has been wounded. The Westphalian paradigm is really what's at stake as we try to think through the limits or the endurance of empire. Secondly, Adrian's point that empire often or always has a mission attached to it, a civilizing. This, of course, puts you in direct odds with Jay, for whom empire is the alternative to civilization. I'd like to hear you two thrash that out. I agree with Wayne that and others that China is the country to think about. This is a matter that came up at our conference in February, was it? That the Chinese model can represent a model of efficiency, of success that does not seem to be present in the American one. We talked about the infrastructure problem. That's just one indication of that. No doubt, there are downsides to the Chinese model as well, but being able to rely on trains and buses and transportation is something that is foreign to the American experience. But yeah, and the price for that is a kind of command system where things get decided and are carried out. It's unthinkable in the United States. This issue of hard and soft power, the soft legacy of empire, I think is crucial. In the melodramatic discussion of empire, we often think of the gunboat diplomacy and the troops marching in, but in fact, it's a whole network of practices that's really at stake that are probably or possibly more efficient than the direct utilization of hard power. A question that really no one has addressed so far. I wonder if the technological transformations of the past 10 to 20 years, the internet, the computer really changed the whole discourse of where the debate about empire is. Right? It's not the Marines in Silicon Valley. I'd like to have that talked about. And then, Adam talked about supranational governments, and that's certainly an aspect of the empire discussion. The empire is that which stretches out over multiple nations or ethnicities or cultures, somehow binds them together. And but you slide that into the notion of global governance. I think right now, from my point of view, the empire discussion is more about the conflict between large super-regional powers rather than a pursuit of a single model of global governance. Anyway, those are my takeaways. I open the floor to, please. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Well, yeah, the soft power, the idea, and what are the 80 largest economic entities of the planet? 30 of them are companies. 30 of them are countries, and 50 of them are companies. Is the four horsemen of the apocalypse: Amazon, Apple, Microsoft, and Google. Yeah, Google. And the half of the jobs, half of the revenues of Fortune of the New York Stock Exchange companies are overseas. Half of them in the United States, half of them overseas. GM, it used in the 20s, as GM goes, America goes. Well, how about when GM produces half of its cars in China? Well, then where's the line now? And how many international conferences have you gone to where the language isn't English? How many? Anybody raise their hand on that? There's been a couple, okay, but it's darn few. Almost all. And so there are many different levels of empire.
Yeah.
I gave you a few.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. I was very provoked by Adrian's point about power being imperial. And I wanted to ask you what you think the role of agency and intentionality are there. Because it made me think of a couple of things. First of all, Lars' point in the very first paper about empire evoking a sort of will and desire that almost seemingly operates at, I guess, a supra-cognitive level of intentionality, or maybe subcognitive, I'm not sure. And then I was also thinking of some of the earliest debates after Edward Said about Orientalism, the critique that, it's all a big conspiracy theory. Well, no. In defense, if one wishes to defend some of what Said was arguing following Foucault, it's about how stuff is happening at a deep epistemic level, that might not necessarily equate to empire being this intentionally conspiratorial use of power. So I wanted to ask you, in that relationship between power and empire, what you think the role of agency and intentional action is. Thank you so much.
Maybe we'll take these first 5 comments and then So David, I think
you I guess I'm wondering about the way in which we should maybe think about the Westphalian system in the mission state as another form of a kind of imperial system, to the extent that the Westphalian system is a kind of system of regulating relations between different peoples. And maybe we could think of empire as really doing that. And also about the way in which the success of the Westphalian system really was the success of the different empires, the French Empire, the Spanish Empire, the British Empire, these different colonial empires that were, well, certainly at that time, sort of the Spanish and the Dutch empires were developing, and that in thinking about the nation states at that, we're really thinking about sort of these nation empires, and that in thinking through empire today, we might have to sort of pose one form of empire, which is to say a kind of nation-state-based system of empire, which you've got a system of relationships between nation states, where if you had the British overall for a long time, kind of presiding over that kind of network, maybe the United States replacing them, and then the other notion of empire being one that would be kind of pre-nation state, in which that would allow for this would maybe be something more like Russia or China, where you would have more like a kind of older model of empire that includes multiplicity within a single political unit rather than sort of separating out multiplicity into individual homogeneous nation states. So I'm kind of thinking through different ways of thinking relationships between peoples as kind of one of the key things that empire does.
Just add to that, would you put Austro-Hungarian Empire fit into that model?
Or the Ottoman Empire.
Right. Yeah, right.
I just want to pick up Adam's closing point around mix and match in the modern era, and your point about technology. Of course, the internet has changed spatial boundaries and unleashed relationship forming across a pan-continental relationship forming and an idea generation, idea spread and diffusion. I do think that's one of the big discontinuities of previous imperial eras is actually the ability to mix and match models, because you can gain inspiration by looking quite far across the world, just picking apart at once. I think one of the features of 21st century multipolarity, if you want to call it that, or reordering, is, I guess, a much more fluid geopolitical marketplace, where you can maintain several alliances, even if they're apparently contradictory. Turkey is a very good example of doing that. Turkey's probably engaged in mix and match at the moment in a very unique way to its own geopolitical circumstances. The question I had is more for Wayne, actually, with the Asian perspective on there. Given that we're talking about mix and match and we can extend relationships and inspiration and diffusion in a way that isn't bounded by spatiality, from an Asian perspective, how much of what we might think of as being empire was actually just parallel civilizational development through proximity? And I wonder whether there was a lot of, parallel developmental, cultural expansion, cultural extension, which was actually driven more by adjacency rather than necessarily complete control by one over the other. And I wonder whether that issue of adjacency is actually, obviously the maritime empire slightly break that because they're stretching across the world. That issue of adjacency is, we're just seeing that now in East Asia once again. But it doesn't necessarily amount to empire. It didn't necessarily amount to empire even back in the day. That's really the question.
That's less. We'll go another round.
So I thought Adrian's comments were particularly provocative, I thought, because what I heard you say is that basically the Westphalia nation-state system is more or less bankrupt as a normative model. And if we are thinking about normative models for politics going forward in political theory, we ought to look at basic political historical continuities that happened well before the Treaty of Westphalia. And as I understand it, that takes kind of an imperial form. And so you mapped out three characteristics of imperial power, and so on and so forth. Stabilizing borders, creating outlets for trade, and a civilizing mission. Yes? So it occurred to me when you map that out, is the first two, stabilizing borders and creating outlets for trade, seem to be characteristic of modern nation states, as we understand them now. Which leaves a third, the civilizing mission, a highly problematic element. I mean, is that something we so to speak, really need at this point in the global modern world, where, as it were, global civil society has taken a certain form, and I would argue it's taken an ethical form. Right? That we're problematizing universal ethics, and we've gotten used to that. But I think we look closely at what goes on. We think global civil society and economic and maybe implicitly hegemonic political terms, but we forget that there really is a kind of universal ethical tendency in modern global civil society. As global civil society, properly understood, has an ethical character.
What is it?
I believe it's the spread of robust notions of individual personhood and all that comes with it. Right? What happened in the heads of Enlightenment philosophers has been translated into praxis in a certain way. More or less. It's always more or less, right? It's not all in one final swoop. But I mean, my question is: do we really need this political conception of the civilizing mission anymore? Okay. So,
Just like universal.
Well, I suppose it's your answer.
A couple of points I wanted to pick up on. One was about China. As the last 10 years or so, I've actually lived part of the year in China. So when I hear statements about efficiency, I tend to hear a discourse that is popular in China and a discourse that is popular among some abroad, but I'm not sure I recognize it so much. I mean, a lot of the infrastructure and everything else, I think, over the last 20 years can be summed up as the massive application of misdirected effort. Anyway, aside from that, the point about like languages at conferences, I think, is a microcosm of a lot of this, which is I have attended conferences where Chinese is being used in Spanish and so on. I'm reminded of a linguist who had recently gone to a conference, and he told me that one of the Chinese participants said that a sign of China having arrived as a sort of real competitor to the West and China regaining its rightful place would be that if you had a conference with participants from China and Korea, for them to be speaking English would be 不自然, like unnatural, right? Whereas for them to speak Chinese would be natural, right? This would be a restoration of the natural use of Chinese. The question I wanted to ask was, in this imaginary Chinese century, would it also seem natural to them for, say, a Nigerian and a Paraguayan to be using Chinese together at a conference? And I think that would seem a little less natural for them, right? Now, the reason I mention this example is it goes to this question of sort of who owns a tradition, right? Or who owns these markers of culture? And I think one of the difficulties a lot of rising competitors outside the West have is they often don't think of their own contribution as truly universal or open, right? They see it as a marker of particularity, right? They see it as something which is defensive, particular, regional, and so on. And this, I think, is a huge obstacle to laying claim to that kind of universal terrain. So I think we do need to ask that question about who is seen as owning a tradition, or who is seen as owning cultural resources, or who are those cultural resources seen as being accessible to. The second point I wanted to pick up on was a couple of different questions which were around this theme. One is the idea that older empires had a greater degree of internal diversity, right? Or that it was somehow different from the idea of a sovereign Westphalian state and transnational economic circuits. I think that there is something in that older model which does need rediscovering, and I think that in some ways that can be encapsulated as the strength of society in contrast to today's emphasis on the economic and the political, right? So if you see traditional societies having its center of gravity much more in society, right, rather than in a kind of stripped down market or a modern bureaucratized dominant state, I think those claims of society, which in many ways are also the claims of tradition, the claims of pluralism, this implies a very different view even of sovereignty or the relationship between state and society, which I think would need critically examining. And I will actually be talking about this when I give my longer talk on Sunday. But I think that this idea of a genuine social pluralism, which is not simply about individual rights, or this sort of atomized individual in relation to these larger structures, I think that's something else which we can rediscover from older empires or older spaces, as it were.
Thank you very much for those very interesting, illuminating comments and questions. I'll try and answer the sort of two or three that have been put to me more specifically, and I will start in reverse order if that's all right. So I'll start with Jay, and I suppose my response to that point about global civil society is that I think you're right to say that there is a genuinely ethical dimension here. Because this isn't primarily about power or about wealth. This isn't primarily even about social status, which you could say are the kind of three things that, very different cultures, in very different ways might value. So, power, wealth, and social status is, sort of three dimensions of social organization. And I think global civil society is perhaps, fundamentally ethical in the way that you say it is, insofar as it's actually about something more primary than any of those, which is a form of self-association. So, we can organize outside of structures of the state or the market because there's a sense of freedom and not just a negative freedom, not just an absence of constraints, but the freedom to associate with others around certain shared ends. So that could be, single issue politics, you're involved in feminist struggles or ecology or whatever, or something, much more about the autonomy of civic institutions. So I think that's right. And the problem is that a lot of the actual manifestations of global civil society have been either hijacked by or absorbed into something that is much more looking like a liberal empire, which is civil society is essentially an extension of state and market, and it kind of compensates for the failure of state and market, but it's not generally autonomous. It's been essentially absorbed into an instrumental logic. So I think the actual manifestations are more problematic than the theory that you, I think, rightly appeal to. Just, to give you two examples. One is, we may all be, very much in favor of, successful businesses doing something that isn't just in their business interest, but then you wonder what these foundations that have been set up by a successful business, men and women actually do. The Soros Foundation, Open Society, it's not clear it's actually quite as ethical as the theory that you mentioned, or the Gates Foundation, or any philanthropic enterprise you might mention. So it's just a question of where's the reality of this ethical dimension, and I'm not sure we can find that many. I think what we see around, I wouldn't say around the world as too general, but in many countries you see a loss of autonomy of the intermediary institutions. And I think that itself raises all sorts of issues. I wasn't implying that we need a civilizing mission. I just think it's almost like a historical fact to say that the civilizing mission, I think, is part of how power operates and expresses itself. And I think there's a lot of mythology around all these civilizing missions. But I think what is clearly the case is that in every point in time, there are certain forces that are not promoting civilized life, in the sense of upholding certain notions of flourishing or goods, that may take different forms, but that I think are true about what it is to be human, what it is to live in this natural world and so on. And I think there are forces that are in that sense barbaric, because they deny people the possibility of a civilized life. And by that we mean a life that is about flourishing, not at the expense of nature or of others. And that then takes me to David's point, which I think is a very good way of putting it, where Westphalia is really much less of an exception, unlike, I think, some of the, its own advocates. Because you're right, it is probably just another form of imperial power, just organized differently. So I think that is a good way of putting it, except that it claims to be something that it isn't. It claims to be about national sovereignty, when in effect, a lot of countries that are subscribing to this, think of Woodrow Wilson's 14 points, right? Then actually don't at all abide by this, because after Wilson, there is still a sense in which the national sovereignty of some countries is clearly, more valid than that of others. So, yes, I think you're right, it is a nation-state-based form of empire, but of course the theory of Westphalia is we will now respect the sovereignty of other countries, we will not interfere. And of course it started with the religious wars around, do you interfere in who is personal capital? Because really the origins...
You want to just shut it off?
Sorry. Yeah, because the origins of Westphalia in 1648 go back to the Peace of Augsburg, where basically, European countries have been at war around, Protestantism, and Catholicism basically said the ruler will determine the faith in his land, right? In the prince's land, the prince's religion. Cuius regio, eius religio. So the point is that we've never really abided by this, because we've always interfered in the internal affairs of other countries. And certainly the great powers have. Again, it goes back to stabilizing their backyards and so on. So I think the theory of Westphalia is very different from the reality. You could say that about any, but I think it's certainly true of Westphalia. And finally, the very interesting question on power and intentionality, and it's something I need to think about more, but one thing I'd say is I think the problem with Westphalia is that it relies on this primacy of will. It's all about individual will and the will of the state. And these mirror each other, because they're unmediated, they're all about one instance, and will
takes primacy over intellect, over reason, over moral sentiments, over anything else. And so voluntarism is at the heart of the Westphalian system, not just theoretically, but very practically. It's individual rights protected by the collective power of the state. And there's no sense of reciprocity, no sense of mutual obligations. It's all about rights. Whereas I think imperial forms of politics that aren't Westphalian, I think also talk about some of the more reciprocal arrangements. Now they can be exploitative, oppressive, or they can be much more respectful of difference, and they can be about, a proper sense of neutrality. But I think the point is, Westphalia is all about the will, whereas I think that what you're talking about, the kind of intentionality that transcends individual will, may well be present in other forms. And to conclude, it's interesting to go back to the works of someone like Ivan Illich, who said the great paradox is that once you talk about the person, you try and preserve the dignity of each and every person, you will always have a problem. The moment you try and institutionalize this into forms of representation, into forms of participation, it will always end up becoming impersonal. It's almost, for him, some kind of necessity. The institutions, the best intentions in the world, will end up being the opposite of what they were designed to be. Think of the welfare state. It's supposed to be universal, now it's rationalizing and it's cutting people out. It's supposed to be recognizing mutual arrangements, now it's just the state or market forces determining what benefits people get. How do we escape this? That institutions that were set up with good intentions about human dignity and flourishing end up being the most impersonal forces that dominate us, and I don't think that's been solved. I think that will always be a human dilemma.
I have problems because I disagree with almost everything everyone else says. And in every case, there's a book on that topic you haven't read. So it isn't that I'm right, but there's a book you haven't read. So in the case of Westphalia, you need to look at the literature on it, and the idea that it's about nation states has been refuted for 40 years. Archbishops sign it. Look who signs it. And then you'll see that IR rests on fantasy. They don't do the rigorous history that we need. Point one. The adjacency question from Samir is much more interesting, of course, but it's not enough just to read the book The World of the Gods on the Sanskrit Cosmopolis, which was an adjacency. The spread of Sanskritic civilization around Asia is very much an adjacency thesis. But the case of China is not centrally a case of adjacency, and Japan is not a case of adjacency. It isn't just spatial, it's also about the interconnectivity of the world. And most of what people in France and England say about world history is nonsense, because they don't look at where anything came from. When you press them, they really just engage in group egoism. It's us. If you go to a course in civilization in any French high school, you'll encounter this story. It's no better at Oxford and Cambridge. Read Bailey's stuff on the British Empire. It's beautiful, he writes very well. He doesn't know where anything came from. And Asians are no better. I've been in Beijing with people who told me that certain things were Chinese. I said, but of course they're from the Middle East. And that's true. And that's the answer to the adjacency point. Most of the stuff called Chinese at the moment is probably not Chinese. Beijing is not a Chinese city. It's a Manchu city. The things the Chinese wave up as the emblems of their civilization came from foreigners. The West that Adrian's in love with is not Western. It comes from India. The Greek philosophy is entirely imported from India. We have now detailed studies of that. And this can be played for everybody. It's not a point of arguing one or the other, but the actual history needs to be read. And 500 books comes out a year, I don't expect you to read all of them. But if your argument depends on the point, you should have read the most recent book in a major European language. I think that's fair. And I don't think you have. So we've dealt with those 2 points. The third point, I think, is the nation empire contrast that Russell draws, but the main works in world history have blown that up for the last 10 years, because it's absolutely true that, of course, some empires, so-called, were actually nation-state regimes. That's perfectly clear. And it's also clear, of course, historically, that many groups that called themselves empires, we now would never call empire, and would even wobble about nation. In the time of Henry VIII, Britain is an imperium. If you translate that as empire, you get it wrong. But then if you translate imperium as empire, you get it wrong. It means the area that the magistrate has within his control. So the whole of this literature is riddled with historical error, failure to look at the relevant archival sources and the relevant language, wrong-headed analogy, and a kind of mad teleology, according to which what Adam called the toolbox? but it was the equivalent of the toolbox. The techniques available grow over time, you borrow from the neighbors. Israel drops and learns something from Babylon and Assyria, and over time you get a bit more sophisticated, a bit more complicated, you own more bigger and larger companies, something like that. It all has to be blown to smithereens. Of course people borrow from the cases they know you can borrow from. But then you have to study which ones were they. You can't just take it from paperbacks. Capitalism comes from China. It wasn't invented in the West. And one could go through case after case after case. And the Israel-Babylon one, we can talk about that if you prefer. But of course the idea of Israel is largely a fantasy. The idea that they were in Palestine at those dates is not confirmed by the archaeology. The idea that they differed from Canaan is absolutely refuted by all the recent Israeli studies. So one has to be careful not to talk mythic history. I think mythic history dominates this conference because it dominates politics, sociology, and international relations. So you have to look at the history. Haven't got time, understand, that's perfectly correct. Then you have to look at structure and form, and here I do agree with David and Jay, and I think you can blend them a bit of the realism with a bit of the idealism. What Jay's saying that is absolutely right is that normativity developments have an objective logical space. And they do spread, and they do pick up other countries. But as you do it, you have to do the history too. So yes, the civil society normativity spread, but most countries in the world have no civil society. There are 5 books on that point, and no Islamic country has civil society in the American sense. I've written a book about that. And I got $1 million from Soros to write that book. So I do know something about it. So we again do have to take the normativity, but we have to do the empirical check. And as for global civil society, I think that's just nonsense. I don't think it exists. In fact, civil society itself, as you know, is a mistranslation of something out of Hegel, and certainly he didn't mean that, as Jay knows very well. Where does it all take us? We do need to study organisational form over the entire historical record and its consequences. And they're really quite simple. It's a bit like having water on a farm. Do you want the water to go up the hill? You have to do certain things. You don't want it to go down the hill, you need a dam, you need a wall. The whole of the history of the human race is governed by simple organisational logics. And if you get them wrong, you go under. I fear for your country, sir. I fear for China. Now, I seem to be a friend of China and to be naive about China, but of course, I was in China before this gentleman was born, I think. I was certainly there in the Cultural Revolution. I was trained by the Red Guards. I'm not particularly optimistic, either about contemporary China or its future. But I don't agree with Adam about its role in the near future in terms of influence, because the Chinese language is spreading extremely fast over the whole of the Pacific and the whole of Africa. And the idea that people couldn't pick it up if there was money in it is naive. The idea that we're not already, in a certain way, influenced by Chinese practice is simply wrong, because we didn't get it from ourselves. What you said in the first half is right, the second half is wrong, I think. But that's enough.
That biographical background was still good.
But I wasn't just in the Cultural Revolution. I was in the French Revolution, and I was.
Okay, we can have another
You get the
short
joke.
round, please. There's one here. 2. Yeah. Oh, Richard. Oh, Richard. 1, 2, 3, 4.
I listened with great attention to Wayne's remarks about definitions of empire and all that, and we are all full of definitions: empire, sovereignty, populism, capitalism, democracy, and we can discuss for hours how these things mean, if we don't ground them into facts and people's questions of history and everything. And I was particularly interested also what you say about China, because China is really the great novelty in the last years, and everybody's looking at China. Is China, my question to you, since you know China, is if you think that it is still a would-be empire. I say countries like Russia, for instance, like Turkey, these have a knack for empire. I mean, they have it in their brain, they have it in their mind. Whether they think or not, in the ancient times, the time of Berman in China, everything was Chinese. The sky was Chinese. The sea was Chinese. And they were like this. And tomorrow, during my presentation, I will say a few things about China in this respect. In the meantime, I would take the opportunity to ask you if you think that China, in a new form, obviously, will exercise some form of power and some authority on the Western world in the form of some form of empire.
Let's hold off and have Richard. Thanks so much. So following on from that, my question, in a sense, is can universalism be universalized? In other words, Adrian is going. The state, like any social form, rises and falls. It's not universal. It's not perpetual. It's not going to, like all social forms, perhaps except empire, which does seem to be one of those universal forms. But the question follows on from what's just been stated. In other words, I don't go buy into globalization as some autonomous process. But what is happening is clearly over the last 200, perhaps more, there's been accelerating process of intensification of aspirations for some sort of global governance. And English school people will talk about it in terms of international society. These are issues which do not belong to the West. So in a sense, I slightly question Adam's point that this is Anglo-Saxon in origin. You could say that for the last 2,500 years, that China's been debating these fundamental questions, the role of the individual, between the Confucians and the legalists, for example. In other words, that these universal questions have been appropriated by the so-called US-led liberal international order since the Second World War. Lots of other people have contributed to it. And so the question now is a genuine question. The degree to which these new forms of human community can become a property of all of humans, if you like, rather than one self-declared set who claim to be the guardians of certain international norms. Our dear leader, great leader, Theresa May in the UK, constantly talks about and uses it as a disciplinary technique about we have a rules-based order. Everybody else is barbarian, everybody else is savage. Language of imperialism enters very deeply into British political discourse, the way it's dealing with Russia today and so on, and indeed most of the West. This is just classic barbarians, the periphery. We have this external. But there's this counter-movement of United Nations, Global World Trade Organization, other peace movements. Since the end of the 19th century, the Imperial Russian state was deeply involved in developing all of that. The question, can we shift away from this sort of particular global orders to a genuine international society within the present international system, if you like, which is different with hierarchy and all of that. So, I actually begin to feel that China today, Russia today, European Union today are going to form an alliance, effectively, I shall talk about this later, because of the way that the center of the empire, if you like, is beginning to defect from its own rules by a very peculiar process, just like Russia defected from the Soviet Union in the center. No one expected that. The center defects from its own order. And this gives us a unique opportunity. So I don't see disorder out there. I see the emergence of a genuine new forms of, as Wayne was saying, and new forms of political community are going to be established by the sheer of events.
Excellent. What you said, a new type of community because of events. I was bringing up the notion of the extraordinary events to come. If we haven't experienced some form of global weirding or global climate change or whatever, well, talk to me. I just came back from Hurricane Lane, so at Honolulu. But putting that aside, pandemics, global pandemics, and I'm building on to this, or some type of catastrophe dealing with our cyber infrastructure that can happen very easily. I mean, we're dealing with satellites that can be knocked out of orbit by meteorites, as we'll discuss on Sunday. So we've got a number of things that would be extraordinary events, and again, we're still talking ordinary times. I mean, we've been blessed these last few hundred years. When we deal with truly precipitating events, will some of these more ancient concepts of empire arise? What again to bring up China? What entity would be best to deal with some of the amazing events in space. Perhaps China would get the edge. Perhaps some union, as we've been talking about. But again, the notion of what would happen in extraordinary times. The flags. Perhaps some of these would be precipitated intentionally without getting too much into the conspiracy theory realm.
I'll be careful here because there are books I haven't read even on my own bookshelf, and I don't want to go home. But Adrian, in terms of the decline of the nation state, I was interested in that because it seems to jar with the sort of post-liberal movement in the British Labour Party, and I'm asking obviously because you've played a significant part in that. Who seem to notice a continuing emotional attachment to the nation state, particularly in relation to defending themselves against a sort of global systems of nowhere who are imposing neoliberalization on them, and also against the sort of empire of the EU. And I'm using that term analogically there, so I should shut up and go home. So I'm just wondering, sort of, how you deal with that kind of contradiction.
I don't think I should be really talking about China because it's complicated and other people may know much more than I do. But even that word, we must be very careful. Would China? What are we talking about? Do you mean the Chinese government? Do you mean the Chinese Communist Party? Is that what you mean? You don't mean surely the Chinese people. You surely don't mean the 18 minority peoples. You don't mean the vast amount of China that isn't China, that's been taken by the Chinese and held by force. You don't mean perhaps Tibet. Do you really mean half of Vietnam? What are you talking about? We have to get more clarity or we talk nothing. On the question of China's imperial or empire-like activity, the man who has the office next to me in Australia put a book out this year called The Chinese Silent Invasion of Australia. It led to detailed legislation to control Chinese political activity throughout the country. He then spoke to the State Department of the United States who's passing the same laws. Is that enough of an answer, Richard? But I don't have delusions about Chinese imperial empire, but of course the Chinese state, like any other state, will press its advantages. And ruthlessly so. It is doing so throughout the whole of the Pacific, especially at the moment in Papua New Guinea, all over Africa. They're showing no more concern for the people than they show for their own people. And I'm making an Adam Stuyvesant message there. This is a tough regime in China. It's recently got a great deal more tough. It's going in a very frightening direction. Xi's giving speeches to the Red Army, preparing them for war, telling them to die for China, telling them the trouble is coming very, very soon. I'm not saying this is the case, but if you read the text, you'll see it's very wrong to have an optimistic view of China.
Adrian. Well, following on from that, I think I'd probably describe my own sort of outlook as not optimistic, because I don't believe in kind of shallow progress and all this kind of Whig history of, we'll finally get to the kind of, end of history type scenario. But I think hopeful that things can be different, because things are so fundamentally contingent, and I think agency is something which, unless you genuinely rob people of it and destroy their humanity, is always there. Dignity and agency are not, finally and perpetually destroyed by any one system. And when it gets to the point, there tends to be very often a counter-movement. So, you have counter-movement against slavery, you have counter-movement against serfdom, you have counter-movement against forms of, oppressive or totalitarian rule. There isn't a linear history. There never has been and never will be, nor is history purely cyclical. It doesn't just go around and repeats itself. And I think Marx had a good point about, when it does, then it still is different. So neither linear nor cyclical. It's much more complex than that. And I suppose the forces really aren't so much the ones that we're told we're facing. It's not about globalism versus nativism. That's another binary, which is just a variation on left, right, individual, collective, state, market, and all the binaries we've had for so long, which have never captured reality, which have never captured our experience. They're just superimposed. And because they're just general categories that are genuinely meaningless, and I mean that in the sense of conceptual meaningless, they're empty, it really doesn't make much sense to try and understand the world, historically or now, by using them. And so in that sense, rather than replacing an old set of binaries with new ones, let's try and think through more interesting ways. Paradox is a much more interesting concept, because we see lots of paradoxical combinations. The local and the global. That's not a binary, that's actually more paradoxical. The local can be the most global point of view you can have. Just as the global never comes in and of itself, it's always mediated through the local. That goes back to particular and the universal. That's, I think, a more interesting way to look at things. And on the specific question asked by Tim, I suppose, we see lots of paradoxical combinations with the British Labour Party, since you mentioned it. I think with Jeremy Corbyn, you get on the one hand, the desire to have, more socialism in one country, get out of the capitalist club that is the EU, according to him, and have that kind of socialist economy of the 1970s style. And at the same time, you have a politics that is also driven in part by tech utopianism. We can create a post-capitalist economy without work or workers. And not just to make that as a descriptive statement, but actually to think of that as desirable. That they want to bring about a new form of capitalism that is post-capitalist. There's another paradox for you might say it's a straight contradiction. Right? And is it really desirable to create an economy without work or workers, where we all live off some kind of universal basic income? Financed how? By taxing the big tech platforms, and that's come up, and I just wanted to say a word on that. Because I think the real issue isn't, Jeremy Corbyn, it isn't about globalism or nativism or the anywheres and the nowhere. Any of those binaries are, I think is totally meaningless. I think the big questions are questions around what makes us human. How do we have technology that actually serves human needs and interests and preserves the planet? And not technology that dehumanizes us and also, takes ecological devastation to the next level, which is what's happening. And I think what's interesting about the tech platforms is that they really are different. They are not just multinational businesses. I mean, that's really 1990s stuff. Amazon potentially can replace a whole set of open markets with a totally private infrastructure that doesn't just destroy competition, destroys democracy. Even what we mean by democracy, and I take Wayne's point that isn't necessarily quite as desirable as some people think. But they're the real questions. They're over what makes us human. I think so the pivot in politics is now that, are you on the side of something that we might call humanism, and that's a misleading term, or are you on the side of the impersonal, the dehumanized? And I think that's perhaps more of a debate than all of the stuff that is still with us.
A couple of sort of intertwined points that I was hearing from different directions. One was the idea that events will lead to the emergence of a new political order, particularly the kind of events that require some sort of rapid response or concentration of power. I think that risk is something we should be very wary of. There's the old saying in English, marry in haste, repent at leisure. Right? I think you could say by analogy, found institutions or empower institutions in haste because something must be done, and we will repent at leisure as well. And I think that this is, in some ways, a distinctively modern temptation, or at least some of the buffers against this temptation have evaporated in modernity. The French sort of traditionalist libertarian thinker Bertrand de Jouvenel in his book on power said that as far as modern political institutions go, the idea of result holds the entire field. Right? That a lot of the older kind senses of sanctity or limits on power or pre-political goods which should constrain power holders have evaporated with modern secularization. I think that with losing that, we create a vacuum that can very easily and very temptingly be filled by technocracy on a supranational scale or whatever. And I think that this links to a couple of other points that have come up. One, I think a lot of the appeal of the Chinese model to certain strata of people around the world is precisely because it does value results, right? That it does value this idea that something must be done. But by the same token, China is a very modern, very secular society. I mean, there's a deep moral vacuum in Chinese society, as many Chinese commentators have pointed out. I think there was one quote I heard from somebody that the danger in China is not that people will believe nothing, that they will believe anything to fill that vacuum. Right? And I think that the modern state and the aspirations of this kind of strong state fill a lot of the gap that in traditional societies was filled by other kinds of aspirations and commitments. And that links to the point about what was the term, the emotional attachment to the nation state, right? It's driving a lot of the backlash against globalization. This is partly because the nation state, or that scale of the nation state, seems to be the only alternative on offer that can oppose itself to this kind of vacuous, atomized kind of globalization. So the fact that we see this resurgence of a national scale populism, right? The fact that we see these affirmations of citizenship in an often poisonous kind of way is precisely because a lot of those other options or counterweights have gone. So I think that there is a real danger that comes from this vacuum that's being created in modern society.
I'll sign on to that pessimism, optimism. We've seen the obsolescence of maybe classical model of empire, whether it really existed empirically is a separate question, but as a discourse of formation, it does not seem to hold sway. There's a subtle Hegelianism that goes on in this discussion, the sense that, well, there'll be a new order that's going to emerge. I think that's strangely optimistic. It's not impossible. Whether it's the China, Russia, EU marching together shoulder to shoulder against the decadent United States, or whether it's in response to a cataclysmic event, I think humans have the capacity for entropy. And maybe that's not our worst feature either. We may be entering into an era of competition among not every nation state, but some larger powers. And the Security Council isn't going to count. General Assembly never counted. Global governance really isn't there. It's wolf eat wolf. And on that peculiar I will call this to a conclusion. Thank you very much.